Good morning, everyone. Over the summer, we've been looking at some of the names of God found in the Old Testament, and today we come to the final one in our series, and we'll be looking at Emmanuel, God with us. We're going to be basing it around Isaiah chapter 7, but I also looked at 2 Chronicles 28 and 2 Kings 16 to get some background information. Working in Central and Southern Africa, I used to enjoy finding out the meanings of people's names. There were some really interesting ones, particularly amongst my pupils. Smart, hardworking, bright, but also sad, trouble, tears. Then there was God be praised, thanks be to God, born on Sunday, born well, and one of my all-time favourites, 8 o'clock. I think it must have been a moment of great joy and great significance when that little girl was born. Of course, as they grew up, their names did not necessarily reflect their personalities or indeed their abilities. But with God, there is no disconnect between his names and titles and who he is. From Genesis to Revelation and to the present day, he does not change. He is almighty. He is shepherd. He is the one who sees and provides, and he is God with us. Let's take a minute to look at the backgrounds to Isaiah chapter 7. It's been roughly 200 years since the death of King Solomon, and the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah remain divided. King Pekah rules over Israel and Ahaz over Judah. Then Israel's major neighbour is Aram, ancient Syria, which is ruled by King Rezin. To the east, the power of the king of Assyria is also building, and Assyria has recently attacked both Israel and Aram, and they are looking now to forge an alliance with Ahaz against Assyria. Ahaz, however, refuses. He has a better plan and is in fact going to ask Assyria for its help against Israel and Aram. So he makes his nation of Judah vulnerable to attack from both those two nations. And when we first meet Ahaz, he's frankly terrified, and he's out checking Jerusalem's water supply, which would be a vital resource if the city were to come under siege. What do we know about Ahaz himself? If there was a list of good kings and bad kings, Ahaz would definitely be on the bad king list. Here are a couple of quotes about him. 2 Kings 16:3. He did not do right. He did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord his God. This was in fact the exact opposite of his own father. And then 2 Chronicles 28:19. The Lord had humbled Judah because of Ahaz, for he had promoted wickedness in Judah and had been most unfaithful to the Lord. His disregard for God's law is shown in his practicing what other tribes were doing, worshipping and sacrificing at pagan shrines, and encouraging his compatriots to do the same. He even sacrificed his own son in the fire. This is in direct disobedience to what God had said in Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 10. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. So coming to chapter 7, we see God here taking the initiative and coming after Ahaz with a particular message. God, who is gracious, compassionate, abounds in love, slow to anger, faithful and forgiving, comes to a man like Ahaz. Now there's patience and grace. It's the same for us. While we were still sinners, we're told, Christ died for us. God sends his special spokesperson Isaiah and his son, with the catchy name A Remnant Will Return, to give his message to Ahaz. Let's listen again to his first words. They were these. Be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smouldering stubs of firewood, because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah. Be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart. Aren't those words of encouragement and reassurance? The threat is absolutely real, but contrary to what Ahaz thinks is about to happen, God says this: it will not take place, it will not happen, for the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. Ephraim is Israel. So God knows that Ahaz is making a seriously bad decision by allying Judah with the biggest political game player of the day, Assyria, but still he tries to call him back to faith and trust in God's purposes. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. Maybe he realizes that Ahaz is intransigent or hasn't fully grasped what he's heard, so he tells him to ask for a sign of confirmation. Ahaz can't even obey this very small thing. He refuses God's offer with superficial piety. I will not put the Lord to the test. Is there an element of, I've made up my mind, I don't want to hear what you have to say? And then God speaks to the nation, the house of David. And this is verse 14 again, but I'm going to read it this time in the Message version. So the master is going to give you a sign anyway. Watch for this. A girl who is presently a virgin will get pregnant. She'll bear a son and name him Emmanuel, God with us. By the time the child is 12 years old, able to make moral decisions, the threat of war will be over. So there's the name Emmanuel. This sign and the name Emmanuel are uniquely found in Isaiah, but not mentioned anywhere else in the Old Testament. And we don't know who the child was. Perhaps the child born to Isaiah? That's a bit doubtful. Or maybe even to Ahaz himself. What is of importance is that he is symbolic of the truth of God's promise that only a short time will elapse before both Aram and Israel cease to pose a threat to Judah. Ahaz is determined to tread his own path, seeking security for Judah by means of a treaty with Assyria, rather than by obedience to the Lord and trust in his promises. Interesting, it goes swimmingly at first. Rezin, king of Aram, is put to death by Tiglath-Pileser III, and the Arameans are sent into exile. This is in 732 BC, and in the same year, Israel is soundly defeated. But what seemed like a savvy political move will ultimately be disastrous for Judah. Despite paying a fortune to the king of Assyria from the temple and palace treasuries, Assyria ends up turning on Judah, taking the money and not helping at all. That's in 2 Chronicles 28, verse 20. So it seems to me that in this passage there are 3 things that don't happen. The first of these is that Ahaz does not inquire of the Lord or ask for his guidance or counsel. 1 Chronicles 16:11 says, "Depend on the Lord and his strength. Always go to him for help." This is something Ahaz fails to do. He is in charge of the situation. He will ally his nation with Assyria. He's made up his mind and doesn't need anyone's advice, especially not from God. Do I make choices that way? Am I closed or open to advice, especially that of other Christians? We're predisposed to go it alone, aren't we? Maybe it's even getting worse in Western society. It's my life. It's my body. It's my choice. I'll do what I like. No one tells me what to do. Here's an interesting fact. Did you know that the Co-op Funeral Care have kept a funeral music chart since 2002? I wonder if you can guess which song was number 1 in 2019 for the 9th time. Well, it was Frank Sinatra's My Way. I did it my way. I think he's been dislodged since then by Jerry and the Pacemakers, and I hear you saying, who? with You'll Never Walk Alone. There is actually a second interesting fact in that in 2019, for the first time, there were no hymns on that list, not even The Lord's My Shepherd. Secondly, Ahaz does not respond with worship or gratitude to the promises of God. He's just heard the best news ever. Aram and Israel will be laid waste. The threat of war is going away. He should be jumping up and down for joy, but there's a resounding silence. Do you remember when cheating Jacob was fleeing the murderous threats of his brother Esau? On the way, he encountered the Lord in a dream, who reiterated to him the promises he'd made to Abraham, saying that these were now valid for Jacob himself. And he added these words, "I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you." Do you know what Jacob's response was? "Surely the Lord is in this place and I was not aware of it." He was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place?" And the next morning, first thing, he got up and he set up a memorial of worship to the Lord. The third thing that Ahaz doesn't do is that he does not trust God or believe God's promise. Had he done so, he would never have sold out to Assyria, which in the long term brought not relief from war, but the reverse. Assyria took the wealth from the temple and palace, but he didn't rescue Judah from their enemies. There's a lovely verse in Psalm 148 verse 10. It says this, "His pleasure, God's pleasure, is not in the strength of the horse, nor his delight in the legs of a man. The Lord delights in those who fear him, who put their hope in his unfailing love." In some way, the promise of Emmanuel, God with us, was fulfilled soon after the time it was spoken. But it also lay like a nugget of gold waiting to be discovered until some 700 years later, Matthew quoted it as he related the story of Jesus' birth. Here at last was Emmanuel, God with us in human form. As John wrote, the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness. Unlike Ahaz, Jesus would live a life of perfect obedience, a perfect relationship with his Father, and go on to give his life for us. John again in Revelation, seeing in a vision the new heaven and the new earth and a new Jerusalem, hears a voice from the throne saying, "Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God." So the name spoken in Isaiah, Emmanuel, God with us, has always been God's purpose for his future with us. He wants to be with us forever. Maybe in the week ahead, we can find time to do one of two things. Firstly, reflect on the example of Ahaz. Decide whether our default setting is one of self-reliance rather than dependence on God, and what we might do to change that. And secondly, maybe we could spend some time enjoying God's presence, perhaps using a psalm like Psalm 95 or Psalm 100, and doing what we will one day do forever. Thank you.